Hello friends, I am Shelley Clough and today we are going to be making this quick little watercolor landscape. This is going to teach you some of the fundamentals of painting a landscape, and it will also be totally beginner friendly for those of you who are trying out painting for the first time. So let's go ahead and dive in and I'll walk you through the supplies we're using today. So for paint today, I'm using my Winsor & Newton colors in my starter palette. I have a swatch card of all of these linked below. I also sell this palette pre-filled for you on my website if you want to use exactly what I'm using and save a little money on buying each individual tube of paint. I also have some Canson XL watercolor paper. I just took a 9x12 sheet and cut it into fourths. I am going to be starting off here with my size 6 Aqua Elite brush. I may also use a size 4, and then I have some tape for securing my paper down. So I have my pre-cut paper. I'm just going to go ahead and tape that to my surface and we will get started. So for those of you who have never painted in watercolor before and you're wondering what I'm doing with the taping right now, the reason that we tape paper down in watercolor is because it keeps the paper pulled tight against a flat surface. Because when you get the paper wet, it has a tendency to buckle. The tape helps secure it so that as it dries, that buckling is forced to flatten back out. So that is why we secure it. And what I do, I just sort of pull my tape tight over the paper so that I can sort of see through it and I can tell if it's about half on, half off. I press it down and then I just run my fingernail along here to make sure that it's totally locked into place. And I do that on all 4 sides. So 1, that will secure my paper down, and 2, it will give those nice pretty edges on the finished product as well. If you want to be really precise, you can sort of mark with a ruler, exactly a 1/4 inch in or something like that. But I am not that precise of a person, so I just eyeball it. So I'm going to leave this kind of nearby so we can sort of see what we're going for. But I've got my paper all taped down and ready to go. The first thing I'm going to do on this landscape is create a sky. Now, when we go to paint a sky in watercolor, we kind of have a lot of flexibility of ways that we can do that. Watercolor is very loose and playful, and so we want that to work with us. So I have my size 6 brush here. I'm going to swish it in my water jar. Let me scoot that a little closer so you can kind of see. So I'm going to swish it in there, and then I'm going to go into this color called Prussian blue. Now, a common mistake I see with new painters is that when they're painting a sky, they go straight in with a color that they haven't mixed at all. So it's straight out of the pan. So it's a pure blue, and oftentimes those colors are a little too saturated, and when we paint it as a sky, it doesn't look realistic. So one of my favorite tricks is adding a little bit of yellow ochre to Prussian blue. So what this does is it gives just a little bit of kind of a natural tinge to the color. I like to add a lot of water to that so that it's just sort of a faint, barely there color. You can see in my pan, it looks a little bit turquoise, and I want there to be a lot of water in this puddle because I'm covering a fairly large area, and I don't want to run out of paint and have to remix when I'm halfway through. When we paint a sky, we want to be able to do it all in one sweep, so we don't have one section of it drying and one section of it wet. So I'm going to start with this color and put the deepest color along the top. I like to really concentrate that along the edges and in the corners because that just gives nice framing to our painting, and I'm just putting that color down solid. Now what I'm going to do is rinse my brush, and with this clean damp brush, I'm going to start to move that color down. And I like to do kind of some swirling motions in my sky to just get a little bit of movement. If it's totally straight lines, you kind of miss out on some of that cloud feel. And so I want my sky to be getting gradually lighter as I work my way down, because that's what happens to our natural eye. Is up high, the sky looks like it's a very pigmented, and then right in front of us or closer to the horizon line, it looks clear. And so when we paint a picture or a landscape, we want to sort of mimic that dark to light. And I'm taking this almost all the way to the bottom, but it's super light at the bottom, and this is where my foreground is going to be. So now if you want to, you can leave your sky like this. You can sort of bring your brush in here, swirl it around a little bit, take a clean, damp brush, and these swirling motions, sort of moving up and down, will give some really faint cloud-like feelings. And clouds generally are going to be larger, higher on the paper, and smaller down below. So if you try to kind of lift little clouds out down below, you want them to be a little smaller. But again, we don't want to do too much here. Like, we're just sort of going to let the paint dry the way it wants to. I'm just adding a little extra color around these top corners. And this is kind of what I'm working with. So now the important part here is I'm going to let this dry. I have a little heat gun that's going to speed up that process for me. But I'm going to let this dry completely, and then we can come in with our foreground. All right, so now my sky is all dry, and you can see I've got sort of some fun textures that happened that are just making for a sky that looks sort of dimensional, but there's not explicit clouds in here. So now what I'm going to do is come and create a foreground. So for my foreground, I want to stick with Prussian blue as sort of my base color. When we use similar colors throughout a landscape, it helps it to feel harmonious, even though we're mixing them to different degrees. So when we use similar colors throughout our painting, it helps the whole thing to feel harmonious. So I'm going to stick with that Prussian blue, and then I'm going to add a little bit of cadmium yellow this time, because I want sort of a brighter green for that foreground. And I'm just going to go into that cadmium yellow a couple of times here, and I'm just going to clean out that yellow. I'm most protective of my yellows when it comes to mixing colors. Yellow is the one where I don't really like to leave residue on there. But I'm just going to sort of play with this color back and forth to get it to a place where I like. I'm feeling pretty good about that. And so now another thing to note when it comes to painting a landscape is that things that are further away look more blue. Things that are closer are going to look a little more yellow. So this landscape here, I'm going to add a little bit more blue. And then as I work my way to the foreground, I'm going to add a little bit more yellow. So I'm really swirling my brush in here so that my bristles are nice and loaded with that paint. And then I'm just going to do my best to make kind of a straight line across this. And I want that to be about 1/4 of the way up my painting, right? So here's kind of my initial mark, and then I'm going to add a little bit more yellow to that as I work my way forward. So I'm just going to take some yellow on that. And if it dried a little bit, I'm just going to run my brush back over the whole thing. And we don't need this to be precise lines, I'm just sort of zigzagging my brush back and forth, getting a little more yellow, and then dropping that yellow in the foreground here. Again, if we're doing these kind of blooms and whatnot, that's all going to just work with our painting in the long run. I'm just sort of zigzagging my brush back and forth to create a little bit of texture in that grassy area. But now I'm going to let that dry for a minute, and right above it, I'm going to paint these blue mountains. So for my mountains, I'm going to take Prussian blue and a little bit of indigo. So indigo is going to sort of gray that Prussian blue down a little bit, because colors that are further away also look less concentrated. You can also add a little bit of Payne's gray if you feel like it's not quite gray enough. And I'm using quite a bit of water on that. I want this first layer to be fairly light colored. And so you have two options here when it comes to letting this dry. You can let your foreground dry completely, or when you put your mountains in, you can just be very careful not to touch the area that's still wet. If wet touches wet, then those colors will merge together. So we want to either let that dry or just be very careful. So I'm going to try to just be very careful here and make my mountains. So mountains, we often think that mountains are pointy, but they are more flat than pointy, I have found. And they kind of go in angles with flat segments. So I'm going to come up here and sort of do a bump, an angle, and a bump. And I want one side to come like that. And then I'll come down, and then I'm going to come back up. And again, just like little angles that jump down here and there. Okay, and so I like them to be slightly different heights, but both of them are pretty low. So I just make that outline and then I'm just going to fill it in with that same color. So if this is drying on you, just sort of as you're filling it in, run your brush back along the area that has dried. So like right here, I'm just going back over that top line and then being careful down here not to let those colors blend when I hit the horizon. So if you're worried about that, you can always let this dry in between steps. So I'm just filling this in here. Okay, so there are my little mountains. Okay, so now I'm going to dry this full layer and then we can come and add some detailing to our foreground. Okay, so I'm going to add some details both to my mountains and to my sort of grassy area. So I'm going to do my mountains first, and what I'm going to do there is go into indigo, because again, it's kind of that grayer blue, and I'm going to get sort of a medium tone of that. I don't want it super watered down, and I definitely don't want it really opaque. What I'm going to be doing is layering on top of what I've already done. So I want it to be a little bit darker, but I don't want it to be overwhelmingly dark. And what I like to do when I'm painting the shadows on a mountain is I'm just sort of creating some lines. I like to have them be on the same side of the mountain. So it's almost like the sunlight is coming from this side, casting a shadow on the left side of my mountains. So what I'm going to do is sort of come here along the top, and then I'm just going to pull some little lines downward, making little sort of angled marks again. And do the same thing kind of on this side, going along that top line and then just pulling some lines downward, kind of catching. This is like highlighting the grooves in our mountain. And you can have those go at different lengths, and you can sort of add them here and there. Wherever you add them, it's going to create a little more dimension on your mountains. So I feel pretty good about that. Maybe I'll do just a tiny bit right up in there, but I think that's plenty. Now we can add some foreground in our grassy area. And so again, here we're just going to learn a basic principle of landscapes. Things that are further away are going to look smaller, and things that are closer are going to look bigger. And so we're going to do that with just these simple little marks in front that are going to give the impression of things like bushes or shadowy areas in our grass. And so we want to mix up a similar color to what we did before. So I'm just going to stick with this same puddle. I've got my Prussian blue and my cadmium yellow, but now I'm going to add a little bit of indigo to that to deepen it up. And again, you notice that we're using kind of similar colors throughout the whole painting to keep that harmony. So I'm going to do a little bit more indigo. And again, you want this a little bit darker, but not so dark that it's a really stark contrast. You want more of a subtle contrast. And then for this, if you want to, you can switch to a smaller brush because we're making really small strokes. So I'm going to grab this size 4 brush by Da Vinci. I always just give my brush a rinse when I get it started, and then I like to roll my brush so that I don't have any droplets on this part of my handle so that they don't dribble onto my paper. So I've got that brush ready to go, swirling it in my color here. And then I'm going to do, I like to compare this to making Morse code. We are going to do like little lines and dots, like boop, 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 boop. If the sound effects help you, great. And so we want those little marks to be a little bit smaller in the background, and you want to keep them fairly straight, maybe with a little bit of stepping down, but you don't want them to be, you don't want a lot of like wiggle in them. You want them to be more straight. So I'm going to sort of do a line here and then some dashes. And as I work my way forward, I'm going to make those a little bit wider, press my brush down a little bit more. I like to do just a little bit of like a zigzag to give the impression of some things happening. And then maybe a little bit over here and some kind of down here. Maybe some over here. You can just sort of play with it till it feels good to your eye. I think I feel pretty good about that. I might do a little bit more right here because it's so light. Okay. So that is our super simple beginner landscape. I'm just going to let this dry completely and then we'll peel our tape off. All right, so there we have it, our super quick and simple beginner landscape for you. I would love to hear if this was helpful for you, if you'd like to see more of these little miniature series, kind of quick and easy watercolor paintings. I would love to see your work. You can tag me on Instagram or join my Facebook group, The Watercolor Playground with Shelley Clough. I'll have the details of that linked in the description box below. But thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you all in the next video.